Circle podcast, the podcast that brings you the extraordinary tales of everyday women who are changing the world. I'm your host, Gertrude Mache, and I'd like to acknowledge traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today. I also like to pay my respects to elders, past, present, and emerging. Every week, we dive into the lives, challenges, and triumphs of women from all four corners of the globe. We're here to inspire, enlighten, and connect, sharing stories that uplift and empower. So grab a cup of coffee, settle in, and join us as we explore the incredible journeys of women shaping our future. This is her story, where every woman's voice matters. Hello, everybody, and welcome back. This is Gertrude Mache here in beautiful Melbourne, Australia. And today I am graced with the presence of yet another fascinating woman. Welcome, welcome, welcome to our tribe. Please tell everybody your full name, where you're based, and share your story with us today.
Thanks, Gertrude. My name is Kylah Morrison, and I am coming to you today from Wajak Budja on Noongar country here in Perth. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the lands on which I'm meeting today and their elders past, present and emerging, and all of the lands on which the listeners are on today and any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women who might be listening in. I'm originally from New Zealand and moved to Western Australia about 17 years ago, and not long after met the boy and followed him up to Northwest Australia, up in the Pilbara in the red dirt. And that was the first time I really got to go out on country and really get to understand the significance of the tens of thousands of years of stories that have been passed down from our First Nations people, and just fell in love with the understanding that I gained. You know, every time I talked to an Aboriginal person or I went out on country, like there was another layer of information and stories and significance in the land and in the stories and in the connection with the people. And so I feel really grateful to be able to work and live in Australia and on these different lands and countries. And fortunately, my career has taken me through a lot of opportunities to be able to experience the value of that as well. So originally started out life as an engineer. I studied mechanical engineering in New Zealand and then moved over to Perth and started work with Woodside. I basically studied again. I was a drilling and completions engineer on their graduate program and spent a lot of time out offshore on the drilling rigs and the gas platforms, and really loved that. I loved being in a practical career where I could get outside in nature. For me, that was out in the middle of the ocean. Sometimes we had onshore gas projects in my summer work in New Zealand, but predominantly in Australia it was offshore projects, and then sometimes I would visit, manufacturing sites for wellheads and drilling pieces of equipment and things like that, which was all very interesting. Not long after that, as I said, I met the boy and moved up to Karratha, and now happily married. I think we've been together maybe 15 years, married 8 years. We moved to Karratha because he wanted to get the work experience onshore up there, and so I moved into a reliability engineering role so that I could transfer to an onshore-based engineering role, and that was fascinating for me to move from drilling completions, obviously right at the early stage of producing oil and gas, and then moving onshore. I could see how it was processed in the LNG plant and then stored in the tanks and shipped overseas. And so it's really interesting. 17 years ago when I joined the industry, gas was the was more favorable, I guess, than mining, which was seen as the dirty cousin back then. And yet 15, 17 years later, I find myself working in mining technology, and it's almost the opposite with the energy transition, mining and critical minerals that are needed to be used in the manufacture of batteries and solar panels and wind turbines and electric vehicles and everything we need to meet the net zero targets that the world, well, majority of the world is aiming towards. It needs mining. And so it's just fascinating to be in the industry and in the sector and just see that shift. Gas is obviously going to be a transition fuel. I now have a portfolio career. I'll go back to the stages, but the portfolio that I have now, I have a board role on a minerals company that has a hydrogen project up in the regions, and I love being involved in the new technologies that are going to help accelerate that energy transition. And then, as I mentioned, I acknowledge that gas is going to be around for a little bit longer. We can't just switch over immediately. So back to my story up in the regions. I left the corporate world just over 5 years into my engineering career. I didn't have the guts to just go and quit and start a business, and so I kind of did it via maternity leave, if you like. So my first son is now 12, and my business is about 12 years old because I started them around the same time. I didn't obviously start my son, but I started my business when I fell pregnant. And then I have another son who is nearly 10, and I have a daughter who has just turned 8 and just got her ears pierced and realized the reality of something she'd been really looking forward to was actually a lot harder than she thought. But together we worked through that, and I encouraged her that she can do hard things. So yeah, being a mum, working in a male-dominated sector, I'm really passionate about encouraging girls and my daughter to be able to be or do anything her heart desires, and equally my boys too. So I take a lot of pride in raising and fostering and supporting children to be their whole selves and to be good humans. And I think having the 3 kids up in Karratha in regional Australia, basically I say my kids were born in the red dirt, and they had many days and afternoons literally playing in the red dirt and making mud piles out in our back garden. I just can't believe that we now live in Perth after a quick trip to London with my husband's work before COVID brought us back to Perth 4 years ago. And we have a pool here, which is fantastic for kids, as anyone with almost teens would know. And yet we never had a pool up in Karratha, and for 8-9 months of the year it's 30 plus degrees, sometimes 40 degrees for a couple of weeks at a time, and so my kids survived by making little mud pits out in the back garden in the red dirt. So yeah, I think they've had a great opportunity to grow up in the regions. I know for me that really helped build perspective about just how much of Australia's, economic drivers and their GDP is actually produced in our regions, and yet the majority of the people live in metro centres, and that's where often a lot of the decisions are made, and yet it affects people in the regions and a lot of where our resources come from. So got involved in a lot of that as the Chamber of Commerce, as a board member, then a president, and then I stepped off that role into the CEO role. That's where I built my board career. So I've been serving on boards for over 10 years, and I really love the opportunity to sit around a board table and problem solve as a team when it comes to strategy and making change, whether that be social change or economic development. And yeah, in that time also was involved as the founding chairperson of the Pilbara University Centre. So again, another initiative that was established to help support families and children who wanted to stay in the regions. Often many of you who are listening who are based in the regions will absolutely know, but for those of you who haven't lived and worked regionally, the isolation can be really lonely at times, let alone the connectivity of internet and things like that. And so professional development is not always afforded to people who live in the regions. Sometimes they have to travel a long distance to be able to access professional development opportunities, and or children move away in senior school years and then at university. And so the Australian government at the time funded the Regional Study Hubs program, which has been absolutely sensational in providing more support on the ground, face-to-face, for children and families and people, who want to study whilst still working, to be able to do that in the regions with, physical locations for tutoring face-to-face and pastoral support as well to support the lectures that are done online. So that background, working with, the local businesses, living and working in the regions. More recently, I've done some consulting with Aboriginal corporations, has all come together in, I guess, my passion for supporting the regions, supporting our First Nations people, and holding on to my roots in the engineering side of things, and supporting the energy transition. So that's me in a nutshell.
Absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing your story with us today. It's really inspiring when I listen to women who have juggled motherhood, changing careers, starting a business. You are just kind of following your nose and letting your life navigate where you were going. Now, your work focuses on helping leaders navigate the energy transition while including First Nations people in this journey.
And so helping leaders in that energy transition whilst also considering the social impact and bringing our First Nations people along with it, for me, comes back to ESG, which is a term that I came across when we moved to London, as I said, to follow my husband for his work. And in Karratha at the time, up in the Pilbara, in the role that I was in with the chamber, there was a lot of talk about social license to operate. And then we moved to London and I heard ESG being talked about. And I was like, oh, I wonder what this is. Hadn't heard it, environmental social governance. Yes. And we were only in the UK for about 8 months. And then COVID meant we were repatriated early back to Perth. And it's really interesting. It took another probably 12 to 18 months before I heard the term being used back in Australia. So it really goes to show that that Europe and the UK and other parts of the world are leading in those aspects. Yes. But I think the energy transition is a really awesome opportunity to include our First Nations people more on that journey than we have before. And so obviously, energy transition, the first people think about is carbon or, carbon reduction, but that's only one minor aspect of it. And even within the E side of things, you've got water and biodiversity and so many things. And then S is obviously the social, which I think for me is where it sits with regional communities, but also our First Nations people. And then governance is something, as a lens we should put across all projects and aspects. Where I think the power comes with First Nations people is that they've been looking after the lands for so many years, for tens of thousands of years. And so if we spend more time walking alongside them, getting to know what their priorities are, how they go about looking after the land and planning for the future, we can actually deliver better results economically than if we didn't do that. And so that's the lens I try to apply, is looking through ESG and then having those conversations with our First Nations people and knowing that it takes time. For a lot of us, we're going to have to build rapport with them. And one great thing that I heard when I was running the chamber is that we don't do things like engaging with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people or local communities or whatever it is because it's a good thing to do. It needs to make commercial sense as well. And initially I thought, well, that sounds like a bit of a cop-out. But they said that you actually need to sort of put it on the balance sheet, if you like. And so one company that was doing a great job in the social license to operate space, they would, put a dollar value to how much time was saved by investing in their relationships with First Nations people, because if they had that rapport and then it came time to approvals or doing up a land use agreement or whatever it was, if they already had that rapport and that relationship with the First Nations groups, they were going to get the approvals through faster. And so then you could put that on the balance sheet. And I just thought that was really fantastic to tie together the social and the economic drivers.
That is just incredible. And you have coached over 300 female leaders in male-dominated industries. What are some of the most common challenges that they face, and how do you help them overcome these obstacles?
Yeah. So the 300 leaders that I've worked through is through different aspects, but predominantly is through a leadership program that I developed with a co-founder back in 2016, Violet Dew, who's a communications expert, who's an absolutely beautiful human. And we did that because, as I mentioned, I felt that professional development was missing face-to-face in the regions. And for me, it was a lack of confidence in myself as a leader. And so I see that a lot in the women that I coach, is that there is sometimes this imposter syndrome. Often it's just a self-doubt in their voice and backing themselves and having those conversations, particularly in male-dominated sectors. And I'm really conscious that a lot of trainers, coaches that work in this space, and women who've been working in male-dominated sectors would say, let's not try and fix the woman, and let's fix the system. And absolutely, there are things that workplaces need to do to be more inclusive and to be able to attract and retain people better. I still find that across the board, and research will back it as well, that women won't put themselves forward for a role until they feel really confident, or they've got someone backing them first before they're believing in themselves, compared to our men. That doesn't mean to say that men don't face imposter syndrome and they don't have a lack of confidence at times and things like that. But that's one really key side of things. Another one is the network building. I find a lot of women, if they've been in corporate for a number of years, they often don't think about taking that responsibility and ownership of their own career trajectory. And we kind of get groomed in a corporate world to rely on our manager and get feedback through performance appraisals and things like that. And we don't look into our personal and professional branding and take ownership of that. So I love helping women, understand their strengths and how to articulate them. And one amazing little tip that I learned from Maggie Palmer, who's got a great app called Pet Talk Her, was to literally pick up your phone. And so anyone listening right now could do that and text a colleague or a friend or someone you know and say, what are my greatest strengths? And you'll be really surprised what they come back with, because often it's hard for us to articulate our strengths because it's so easy for us. We don't notice that that's our superpower. And so working on articulating strengths really helps overcome that self-doubt and the confidence piece, and then helping people or women with their personal branding and that network building that can help them take ownership of their career trajectory.
So what role does cultural awareness and sensitivity play in your approach to leadership development, particularly when working with First Nations communities?
Yeah, it's huge. So for me, in my leadership training across the board, I try to maintain psychological safety. I like to encourage the training days or any groups that I set up to be a safe space for people to share without judgment, without others feeling like they need to fix the person who's sharing the information. And so cultural safety, I think, is another layer. And I've mentioned that, I'm on a learning journey there. And so fortunately, one of my strengths being curiosity and love of learning is that I do like spending time with people, different nations, and getting to know their customs and cultures and things like that. And so it's really important to me. I'm not going to get it right though. And I do know that I wouldn't say that I'm kind to myself and don't go through phases of beating myself up when I get it wrong or could have done it better. But I have got the view and the understanding that it's going to take time, and I need to walk alongside women and, other First Nations people if I'm going to understand how to provide culturally safe leadership training.
That's fantastic. Now, can you share an example of a successful collaboration with a First Nations community that led to positive outcomes, both for the community and the broader organization?
Well, I guess the one that really comes to mind is that the one that I was referring to when we consider what the financial gain or impact is of really diligent and effective, time spent in investing in the relationship and rapport building with First Nations people. And that was with Bella Bella Infrastructure Group, which unfortunately don't have a project going up in the Pilbara, but did have at the time.
Right.
And what was the successful outcomes from that? I think from what I could see at the Chamber of Commerce, so not being directly involved in any of those transactions, was that the approach from the corporate, so Bella Bella Infrastructure Group, was that they absolutely understood the value of engaging with their First Nations people. Yes. They then helped them with supplier agreements and getting them into, opportunities for work, whether that was cleaning the office in the centre of town, whether it was going out in country and doing heritage surveys and things like that. And so that was the one that I was then told, so from the corporate side of things, how did that really benefit them? When they came to an approval at one point, they could hand on heart say that this could have taken 9, 12, 18, 2 years longer had we not invested the time that we did into that relationship and rapport building. So I think that's a success from the corporate side of things. And then the value that I saw coming out of it was, even though the project didn't actually get legs and go ahead, all of those Indigenous businesses and people had been given an opportunity to prove their capability, to improve their capability whilst they were tendering work, and even going to the point where they would. It's quite typical for large projects to only tender for pieces of work that are over $1 million. And for a small company, it's really hard for them to quote on $1 million. And so then they have to partner with others. And so they were going to the point of trying to work out, how can we break packages down so that we're giving more local small businesses, Indigenous businesses, the opportunity to participate in our supply chain. And so, like I say, the project didn't actually go ahead, but there's still a lot of work in the pre-feasibility study, the definitive feasibility study, and all of these stages. There's still work happening. And so local companies and Aboriginal people were getting the benefit of that, and having that, capability of operating in a Western corporate structure. They were given that opportunity.
So how do you see the concepts of reconciliation and partnership evolving in the context of Australia's energy transition? And what advice do you give leaders to contribute meaningfully to this journey?
So that one's really interesting, because with the history of mining and, in Western Australia, at least, state agreements and royalties that are paid to native title holders, I think there is a real opportunity to move away from that and to move to more reciprocal arrangements that might benefit both sides in the energy transition. So, rather than, okay, here's a piece of land, we need to use the land, we're just going to pay you for that. It's, how do we work together, and what projects would you like to be interested in? And the exciting thing with the energy transition is, I think, yes, there is still going to be an impact to the environment and the land for putting solar panels on or wind turbines. However, the destruction that is associated with minerals extraction, I think, is less so. And mining sector has not had a good reputation, particularly, with Juukan Gorge. I think it was maybe around 2020 when a large mining company just blew up a cave, an Aboriginal cave. And so, and so I think mining is getting better at that, but I think the energy transition provides opportunities and partnerships and work opportunities, but also Aboriginal organisations and enterprises the opportunity to do work that is more aligned with the way they've looked after country for tens of thousands of years. And so I think that's the real upside of the energy transition and how we can work better with our First Nations people. And so it comes right back to what I talked about before about spending time having conversations. What are their priorities? What are their interests? What do they want to be involved with? Looking around the globe at different First Nations communities and how they've worked with industry and corporates to better communities and individuals. Yes. I think there's other ways of doing it. There's equity arrangements, there's free carry arrangements, and it's not going to work for all projects. Obviously, there needs to be the economics need to work. Otherwise, you won't get a green light and then no one gets a benefit out of it. But I think it's having those conversations early, looking at things slightly differently, looking at best practice around the world, and really trying to do it differently.
If you could go back and give the younger you 3 nuggets of wisdom about working with Indigenous communities, what would those 3 nuggets of wisdom be?
Yeah, so 3 nuggets of wisdom for working with Indigenous communities. I think number 1, spend the time. Like, time is the absolute valuable currency. Your position, a recommendation from someone else, financial, whatever it is, gifts or offers aren't going to get you the traction that you think you might have got in a Western world. So spend the time. You're going to get it wrong. That's how you learn. And, true reconciliation, I think, is about being brave enough to have messy conversations and vulnerable enough to say, I want to learn, I want to do better, and I know that I might get it wrong. And the third thing I'd say is there's always another layer. It's just such a rich tapestry when you've got tens of thousands of years worth of stories and culture and knowledge and wisdom. You can't learn all of that in a textbook, in one sitting, in one podcast. There's always another layer. And so be prepared to continue to invest in that learning journey.
Fantastic. And now, if you could teleport into the future and meet this wise woman who's made such a difference for people whose voices are never heard, whose knowledge is never brought to the table, what will you say to her when you finally meet her with the work that you've done up until that point?
Wow. What would I say to a wise woman in her 90s about the work I've done on giving underrepresented minorities a voice? Look at that ripple effect that you had. I think so often I can get lost in the overwhelm of just how much there is still left to do, and underestimate the power of the really tiny change, the incremental changes that will compound over time. And so I think I'm hoping that when I look back, I will just see how valuable the ripple effect has been and just be so proud for getting into that line of work and that journey as early as I did in my career. It's the most fulfilling part of the work that I do.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for coming online and gracing us with your presence today. And thank you to my amazing guest and the work that she is doing in bringing about diversity in the corporate world and bringing about change in the world globally. The Diversity Connector is a platform that brings you the voices and stories of people from all over the world to celebrate and embrace our diversity and to reflect back to each and every one of us that diversity is a beautiful thing and something that we should be focusing on. So please tune in again tomorrow when I interview yet another amazing guest. In the meantime, Have a fantastic day, morning, or evening, wherever you are in the world, and bye for now. Thank you for tuning into the Her Story Circle podcast. I hope today's story has inspired you to believe in the power of our stories and the difference you can make in the world when you use your voice. I'm Gertrude Mache, and it's been an honor to share this space with you, where voices from all walks of life come together to weave a rich tapestry of diverse perspectives. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review our podcast to help us share these stories with more listeners. Follow us on social media by looking for the Her Story Circle podcast for more updates. And join us tomorrow for another episode filled with courage, resilience, and empowerment. Remember, your story matters, and together we're building a stronger, more inclusive world. Until next time,